In this chapter, we're going to look at a specific devtool workflow that allows you to modify the kernel and generate a recipe based on the changes that you made. Now, if you look at the documentation on using devtool, there are several use cases for it, and in our case, we're going to use the subcommand devtool modify. And in this specific subcommand, the documentation presents three workflows. We're going to use the first one. So the differences are that the first one, you just specify devtool modify and then the recipe name, and it checks out a separate source folder for the recipe where you can make changes to, and then ultimately so you can make changes to it, and then ultimately you can also build it, but you can also use bitbake, as we will see, for that. And finally, devtool finish appends all of the changes into a recipe in the layer that you specify. The other use cases are also useful. The second one basically just checks out the recipe sources in a source tree in a path that you specify, and the third one is useful, for instance, if you already have a source tree. For instance, I could clone the Git repository for our CMake project, and I would be working on it on my host machine, but then I want to use that inside our Yocto source tree. So in that case, I would use devtool modify -n recipe name, and then I would specify the path to the source tree. So instead of the bitbake using the checking out the sources itself and having a workspace for that recipe, it would use the path that we specify. So let's go ahead and use devtool. The devtool modify recipe name, which is Linux-Raspberry Pi. Which is the name of the recipe for the kernel, for the Raspberry Pi. Now it's going to repeat the do fetch task to get the sources and into a separate folder. Rasp So devtool has created a new workspace for that recipe, where we can change directory into it. Now you could do all the changes that you want here. I'm actually going to use dev shell to change the kernel configuration. So I'm going to do bitbake Linux Raspberry Pi, and then dash command menu config, which is another feature that bitbake has. You can also do this with busybox. So this is using not the previous workspace inside the machine folder and so, but this work tree that we just checked out using devtool. So in terms of changes, I'm just going to make a simple change. Say that we want to have a kernel module which is built in, instead of compiling it as a separate module. For instance, the serial port converter support. So instead of a module, we're gonna have it built in. So we do all of the changes, save the configuration, and in this case, if you look at the .config, so devtool actually tracks that we change the config, because it has a config.baseline and config.new. So suppose these are all the changes that we want to make. So the next step would be just to issue devtool finish Linux Raspberry Pi, and then the layer where we want the changes to exist as a recipe. So devtool is done. It warns us that it didn't delete the workspace, so we should do that if we don't want it lingering around. Now we can actually go to the meta hub shuffle. and you see that we have a new directory, which is recipes kernel Linux, and we have a new recipe. So what this recipe does is simply to append what in Bitbake is called a configuration fragment, and it just modifies the kernel configuration. You could do this manually if you want. We can actually look at the fragment itself. So as you can see, it's exactly the same as the .config format, and it's just setting the specific driver to be built inbuilt versus as a module. So now you can rebuild the kernel or the image, and you will have the kernel changes. As you can see, it's rebuilding the kernel. So yeah, that's the one of the workflows with the devtool. So as an example of using this third use case, you would do devtool modify -n Linux Raspberry Pi, and then give it the workspace or where you have the sources located. So I'm going to actually reuse the previously devtool modify workspace. So this sets the workspace to this path. Okay, so as you can see, we recovered the workspace. If you want to see which recipes you currently have maintained by devtool, you just do devtool status. And if you want to reset the recipe, you can use devtool reset, which then doesn't use that out of tree recipe anymore, and it defaults to the path in our workspace.